The contraction hit her in the parking lot. Kathy Douglas grabbed the side mirror of her car with both hands and held on. Not because she was panicking, because her body had just informed her, without asking permission, that the next 60 seconds belonged entirely to it and not to her. She breathed, in through her nose, out through her mouth. The system she had built over 6 hours of solo labor. 6 hours of managing this alone because the man who should have been beside her tonight had sat across a kitchen table 3 weeks ago and looked at her with the specific expression of a person who has already made their decision and is now just constructing the sentence to deliver it. She had not called him. She had called Yemi instead. Yemi was 50 minutes away. The baby was 3 minutes apart. The math was not good. And Kathy Douglas did not deal in math that wasn't good, so she had gotten out of the car, and she had walked toward the hospital entrance, and the contraction had found her in the parking lot like it had been waiting there specifically. Peak. She held it. Then it broke, and she straightened, and she walked through those front doors like a woman who had not just nearly gone to her knees in a Seoul parking lot at 8:52 p.m., alone. 37 weeks pregnant, and completely out of time. She had been in this building before. That was the thing nobody in this waiting area knew. 4 months ago, she had sat in one of these chairs with a clipboard and a stopwatch and documented 6 separate intake assessments over 2 hours. She was a researcher. Healthcare policy, comparative intake systems across 12 hospitals in 3 countries. She had timed the desk reads. She had noted the variables used. She had written, in the clean, precise language her fellowship required, that this facility demonstrated moderate implicit triage bias weighted toward visible socioeconomic indicators with an average pre-form assessment window of 31 seconds. She knew what this building did. She had the data. She walked to the intake desk anyway because her daughter was coming and there was nowhere else to go. The receptionist looked up. Young, 24 at most, 8 months into the role by Kathy's read of her, that particular combination of practiced efficiency and not yet fully settled confidence that she had documented in junior intake staff across 3 countries. The woman pulled the intake form across the counter and her eyes moved across Kathy once, before the form was even in position. Full assessment, start to finish. Kathy counted it without moving her lips. 28 seconds. She had timed 31 reads like that with a stopwatch. She felt this one the way you feel a door close in another room, the sound reaching you just after the fact. Name? Kathy Douglas. How far apart are the contractions? 3 minutes. Getting closer. The receptionist typed. Her eyes moved briefly to the waiting area behind. Kathy indexed the room, returned. We have patients ahead of you. Take a seat and you'll be called. Kathy looked at her. She looked at the way the woman's eyes were already moving to the next task before the sentence finished. She looked at the specific angle of a person who has completed a decision and is now executing it and does not consider the decision to still be in conversation. She understood the full weight of this moment in the speed of its delivery. She understood it completely and immediately and without any ambiguity. Thank you, Kathy said. She walked to the far wall. She did not sit. She had tried sitting in the car and learned what it cost, and she was not paying that cost again tonight. She found her circuit, window to corner, corner to window, and she began to move. She did not look back at the desk. Variable 1, she thought, pre-form assessment, 28 seconds. The decision that would shape everything else tonight was made before a single box was checked on that form. She called Yemi. I'm coming, Kathy. 50 minutes, I swear. I'm already here. A pause. Yemi had known Kathy Douglas for 11 years. She understood what that sentence meant about what had happened at the desk. Go back, Yemi said. Tell them how close. I already went. Another pause. Longer. Okay, Yemi said quietly. 50 minutes. You hear me? I am coming. I hear you. She hung up and went back to her oval. Window to corner. Corner to window. She pressed her palm to the wall when the next contraction came, and she breathed through it in the deliberate, careful rhythm that was the only thing in this room that belonged to her, and she did not look at the desk because she already knew what looking at the desk would confirm, and she was spending the economy of her energy tonight very carefully, and she was not going to waste any of it on a confirmation she didn't need. 40 minutes she had been here, in a building she had researched, in a waiting area she had sat in with a clipboard, under cameras she knew the placement of because she had read the building's founding documentation as part of her fellowship research. Every angle deliberate, the document said, designed so no patient in the waiting area exists outside someone's line of sight. She breathed through the peak of the contraction and thought about that sentence. No patient exists outside someone's line of sight. She was standing directly under a camera. Nobody was looking at her. If you have ever walked into a room that had already decided what you were worth before you opened your mouth, comment below right now, because what this hospital is about to do to this woman in the next 40 minutes is something that should not be possible in a building that was built specifically to prevent it. Subscribe and stay with this story, because it is about to get worse before it gets better. The wealthy family arrived at 9:14 p.m., and the room changed in a way that Kathy felt before she saw. She didn't need to turn around. She had documented this atmospheric shift in 7 hospitals across 3 countries. The specific pressure change of institutional attention reorganizing itself toward money. She could feel its direction and velocity without watching it. She kept her eyes on the wall and tracked it entirely through sensation. 4 staff redistributed within 90 seconds. She knew, because the ambient sound of the floor changed. Footsteps redirecting, a chair rolling, a phone lifted. Paperwork accelerated. A nurse who had been stationary for 20 minutes was suddenly moving with purpose toward the intake cluster. The receptionist who had given Kathy 28 seconds was now giving this family something that had no time limit on it at all. Kathy reached the wall. Another contraction. This one harder than the last. She pressed both palms flat and dropped her chin to her chest and breathed and counted and breathed, and in the middle of it, she heard the matriarch of the wealthy family speak to someone in a voice that carried the particular authority of a woman who had spent decades in rooms where her voice was the one that determined what happened next. When the contraction released, Kathy looked up. The matriarch was looking at her. Not a casual glance, something weighted and specific and recognition-shaped. It lasted 2 full seconds, held, deliberate, and then the woman redirected her eyes to her husband's wheelchair with the particular purposeful movement of someone choosing where to look. Kathy filed it. She filed everything. That was what she did. 1 floor above the waiting area, in the corner office at the end of the administrative corridor, a man named Seo Jun was reading a procurement report at 9:31 p.m. when a flag appeared on his secondary monitor and he did not see it. The secondary monitor ran camera feeds at the edge of his peripheral vision the way it always did. Ambient. Background, the building telling him it was still breathing. He had designed the camera placement himself. He had adjusted the sightlines personally after the architect signed off, sitting with the floor plans for weeks after the consultants were satisfied, because correct was not the same as right, and he had needed this building to be right. He had implemented the flag protocol after a near miss in the building's 2nd month. Any patient stationary in the waiting area more than 20 minutes post-intake without being called, flagged to his monitor. It had worked every time. It was working now. He was reading about the clinical consultation framework that governed the hospital's intake triage protocols. The same framework he had discovered 2 years after opening, that had been used by the facility in a different city where his mother had died 17 years ago. Wrong assessment, too long a wait. He had found the overlap in a case study cross-reference and had sat with it for 3 days before deciding to keep the framework running, because replacing it meant a floor closure, and a floor closure meant people not being seen. And he was not willing to accept that. Not yet. And he had been reviewing whether that decision still held. and tonight apparently was the night he was going to read the report about it. Instead of looking at the screen that was already showing him, the framework had failed again. The flag blinked at 9:31. He read. On the floor below, Dr. Choi had already tried twice to reach Kathy Douglas and been stopped both times by head nurse Bay, with the calm, immovable authority of 11 years on this floor. The first attempt at 9:20, he had been checking the evening's intake log when his eyes caught Kathy's name, and beside it, his own. Her assigned physician, pre-registered 6 weeks ago. He had met her once at the prenatal appointment, had found her precise, informed, the kind of patient who came with questions already organized. He had looked forward to being in the room when her daughter arrived. He looked across the floor at the woman near the far wall. She was mid-contraction, palm flat against the plaster, head dropped. He could read the interval from across the room. He started moving. Dr. Choi, Bay's voice from his left. Calm. The particular calm of someone who has already decided something. The family at the intake cluster needs the admissions processing completed before the patriarch can be moved to the cardiac wing. I need you there. He looked at Kathy at the wall. He looked at Bay. That patient near the far wall, she's in active labor. I'm her assigned. She's been triaged. She's on the list. Bay's voice did not change volume or temperature. The cardiac patient is the priority right now. Choi stood in the specific suspended moment of a junior physician whose clinical judgment has just been overruled by institutional seniority, calculating the cost of pushing against it versus the cost of complying with it. He was 29 years old and 8 months into his first attending role, and Bay had 11 years on this floor, and the full weight of that differential was in the air between them. He stopped. He went to the cardiac cluster. He did not leave the floor. At 9:34, he tried again. The cardiac paperwork was done. He had been watching Kathy's oval from across the room for 14 minutes, and the interval had shortened, and he was not going to stand at the cardiac cluster and watch it shorten further without doing something about it. He started moving, faster this time, more direct. He got close enough to see her breathing pattern in full, the specific rhythm of active labor deep into its 3rd hour, the rhythm of a body that had been doing this alone long enough that the coping mechanism was now the only thing it trusted. Close enough that Kathy looked up and saw him coming, and something happened in her face. Not hope exactly, the thing that exists in the moment before someone allows themselves to consider hope. A real-time calculation. A woman deciding whether this was different. He met her eyes. He was 3 steps away. Dr. Choi, Bay again. Closer this time, her voice still level, still professional, still carrying the full and immovable weight of her authority on this floor. I need you at the nurse's station. We have a chart discrepancy on the Quan admission. He stopped walking. He looked at Kathy. She was still looking at him. The calculation in her eyes ran its course and arrived at its answer, and she looked away and went back to her oval, and the look on her face when she did it was something he was going to carry out of this building and not put down for a long time. He stood in the middle of the floor for 3 seconds. Then he walked to the corridor end. He did not go to the nurse's station. He positioned himself where he could see the waiting area and the corridor simultaneously, and he stood there, and he was not leaving this floor under any authority that currently existed on it. He was waiting for something that outranked Bay. But here is what Choi did not know, and what Bay had been standing inside since the moment she turned him around the first time. Before Kathy had reached the intake desk at 8:52, before Gina had pulled out the form, before any official assessment had been made on paper, Bay had passed Kathy at the hospital entrance. 4 seconds. A full read, the kind built into the body of a senior nurse after 11 years on a triage floor, the kind that runs automatically, invisibly, in the movement of a senior staff member past a waiting patient. She had made her assessment. She had kept walking. She had not stopped, had not flagged, had not redirected anyone toward the woman who was 3 minutes apart and managing it alone. And then Gina had looked up at the intake desk and run her own 28-second read, and every decision she made had been consistent with the read Bay had made 4 seconds earlier at the entrance. Not because Gina had been told what to think, because Bay had shown her how to move. In the 30-minute onboarding session on Gina's second day, in 11 months of working the same floor, in the way a senior nurse moves past a patient without stopping, passing the read along without ever naming it as a read, without ever identifying the variable that made it, which meant it could never be corrected because it had never been named. Bay had seeded the floor's trajectory before the form was touched, and then she had redirected the one doctor who tried to interrupt it. Twice. At 9:47, Seo Jun looked up. The motion on the secondary monitor. Small. Rhythmic. Wrong in a way that he could not immediately name, but understood immediately. He looked at the feed, and he looked at the woman, and he counted 2 contractions across 4 minutes, each one pulling her to the wall, each one absorbed in absolute silence. And then he looked at the flag timestamp, 9:31, 16 minutes ago. His system had worked. His system had sent him exactly the information it was designed to send him, and he had been reading about intake frameworks 1 floor above a woman in active labor, and he had missed it by 16 minutes, and he sat with that for exactly the time it took to understand what it meant, and what it cost, and what the other version of tonight looked like if he kept reading. Then, he stood up. The jacket was on the chair back, the formal layer of his authority on this floor. He looked at it for 1 second. He left it. He rolled his left sleeve to the elbow. He made no calls. He sent no messages to the floor, no warning, no directive that Bay could receive and manage and redirect with the full professional vocabulary she had been using all evening. He pressed the elevator button and stood with his hands loose at his sides. He thought about the photograph on the desk in the corner office. The dark frame, his mother, 17 years ago. A hospital in a different city with a waiting room that looked like all waiting rooms. The same chairs, the same desk, the same intake forms, the same triage logic. He had been 22 and sitting in a corridor chair, and he had understood 2 things simultaneously, with the specific clarity that grief produces in its first hours before it becomes weight you carry forever. He hadn't had the knowledge to change what was happening. The people who had the knowledge had chosen not to apply it in time. He had spent years deciding which failure was his to carry. He had eventually understood the question was wrong. He carried both. He had turned both of them into this building. The sight lines he had adjusted personally, the flag protocol, the corridor he had walked alone on opening day, 37 steps from the waiting area to the delivery wing, counting them with the focused attention of a man pressing his intention into the finished thing to feel whether it had survived the building. The elevator doors opened. The system that doesn't protect people who look like Kathy Douglas isn't broken. It is working exactly the way it was built. And the man who built this building is about to find out that his building is no different. Hit subscribe right now, because what happens when he walks onto that floor is going to change everything. The room clocked him before Kathy did. Head Nurse Bay's posture changed. The specific physical adjustment of a senior staff member whose employer has materialized on the floor unannounced, in shirt sleeves, not looking at her. Not being looked at by your employer was considerably worse than being looked at. The receptionist's hands froze above her keyboard. The matriarch, who had been watching the corridor for 10 minutes without being able to articulate to herself why, tracked him across the floor without moving anything except her eyes. He walked past all of them, past the desk, past Bay, past the family, cluster, like they were furniture. He stopped in front of Kathy. She was mid-contraction, head down, both palms flat on the wall, breathing in the deliberate, careful rhythm she had constructed for herself, out of nothing except necessity, and the understanding that this room was not going to give her anything. She didn't build herself. When she heard someone stop directly in front of her, she looked up slowly, with the careful energy-conserving economy of a woman who has stopped expecting specific things from rooms. She saw a man in shirt sleeves, late 30s, an expression she could not immediately categorize. Not pity, not the administrative concern she had been given at the desk an hour ago, not the performance of attention. Direct, specific, aimed entirely at her, not doing anything for anyone else in the room, just looking at her like she was the only thing in it. "I'm sorry you waited," he said. Quiet. Nothing added to it. "Come with me." She looked at him. He did not fill the silence with anything additional. He did not explain himself or qualify himself or reach for her before she decided. Then the next contraction arrived, and her knees bent under the force of it, and her hand tightened on the wall, and her body made the decision her brain was still processing. He was moving before she could go down. One arm behind her knees, one at her back, and she was off the ground. She grabbed her own abdomen with both hands and said nothing. He turned and walked. Past the desk. Past Bay, standing in the specific frozen stillness of a woman watching consequences arrive at full speed. Past the matriarch who had risen to her feet, without realizing she had done so, and was standing with one hand pressed to her chest, watching him carry a black woman in active labor through her own waiting area in shirt sleeves because nobody else had done it. Through the corridor doors. 37 steps. He had counted them on opening day. He was counting them again now, for entirely different reasons. Inside the delivery room, he set her on the table with the specific measured care of a precise transfer, and then he was moving. Tray, monitor leads, instrument cart repositioned, overhead light adjusted. Both kinds of knowledge in his hands simultaneously. The man who had designed this room, and the man who had trained in rooms like it. Neither one performing anything for anyone. "I own this building," he said, attaching a monitor lead. "I also have a medical degree I haven't used in 6 years. Tonight, I'm using it." Kathy studied him across the table with the focused, unblinking assessment she brought to everything. "Why 6 years?" He watched the monitor power up. The number on the screen was not critical. It was the number of a body that had been working alone for over an hour and was registering the cost in ways the screen was being honest about. "Tell me if anything I do is unclear." "That's not an answer to what I asked." "No," he said. "It isn't." He went to the door. Dr. Choi was in the corridor at the exact distance of a man who had spent an entire evening trying to reach this patient and was not going to be stopped by anything currently alive on this floor. He looked at Seo-jun in the doorway and he did not ask a single question. "In here," Seo-jun said. "Wash up." Choi came in. He went to the sink. His hands were already moving. "Tell me everything that happened on this floor tonight," Seo-jun said. His voice was quiet and precise and not directed at anyone specifically. "At the room. At the record. From the beginning. Leave nothing out," Choi told it. He kept his hand steady and his voice level, and he told it in the exact order it had happened without softening a single word of it. The pre-registration, his name on Kathy's file as her assigned physician. The first attempt at 9:20 and the redirection that stopped it. The second at 9:34, close enough to read her breathing, close enough that she had looked at him for 1 second, with a look that had cost him something, and that he was going to carry out of this room. The second redirection. All of it. When he finished, 5 seconds passed in which the only sounds were the monitor and Kathy's breathing. "She redirected you from your own patient," Seo-jun said. The flat, specific tone of a thing being named so it exists as a name thing. "Yes, both times. You tried twice." A pause waited with something. "You're in this room." He took out his phone, sent one message, put it away. 3 floors above, Director Lim stood up from his desk without finishing his sentence, put on his jacket, and left his office. Kathy had been filing everything. She was a researcher in a delivery room, and she was in active labor, and she was holding both of those things simultaneously the way she had been holding everything tonight, carefully, in both hands, without setting any of it down. "The nurse who redirected him," she said. Her voice was even. "She passed me at the entrance, before I reached the desk." Seo Jun went very still at the monitor. "4 seconds, Kathy said. She looked at me and kept walking. No stop, no flag, no redirect. She breathed through the base of a contraction. I've spent 8 months documenting intake assessments in 12 hospitals across 3 countries. I know exactly what a pre-desk read looks like and what it seeds downstream." She breathed through the peak, released it. "Everything that happened at that desk tonight started at the entrance, before any form, before any official decision, and none of it is on any document anywhere in this building." The room held that. "You're a researcher," Seo Jun said. "Healthcare policy, comparative intake systems." She paused. "I was in this waiting area 4 months ago. Thursday afternoon. Clipboard and stopwatch. 2 hours. I documented 6 assessments." She looked at the ceiling. "I wrote that this facility demonstrated moderate implicit triage bias, weighted toward visible socioeconomic indicators." A breath. "I was right. I just didn't expect to become one of my own data points." Something shifted in the room. Not in the equipment. In the air between 2 people when a revelation lands and neither of them has finished understanding what it means yet. "Why this hospital specifically?" he said. It was not quite a question. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. "There are things I need to get through in order tonight. That answer is coming, not yet." He held her eyes for a moment. She held his back with an expression that was organized around something he did not have access to. Something deliberate, something that had been present in her face since she first looked up at him at the wall and that he had not yet been able to name. He went back to the monitor. Downstairs, Director Lim came through the front doors at 10:04 p.m. and read the waiting area in 2 seconds. Head Nurse Bay unmoved at her station, posture holding the specific rigidity of a person braced for what is coming. Gina's screen, dark. Staff suspended in the uncertain half-motion of people who understand what they have done and are waiting for someone with more authority than them to define it. He walked to the center of the floor. He did not look up from his phone when he spoke. "Shift log from 6 o'clock this evening. Level. Quiet. The volume of a man who does not need volume to be obeyed. Intake record for the patient admitted at 8:52. Full names and current roles of every staff member on duty at the time of her arrival." Head Nurse Bay said, "I can explain the triage decisions made tonight." "I'm sure you can," Director Lim said. "The log first." He began building the document. Every name, every timestamp, every link in the chain from the moment Kathy Douglas walked through the entrance to the moment Seo Jun stood up from his desk. He asked questions with one correct answer and wrote every answer down. No raised voice, no theater. The particular method of a man who understood that what could be argued with could be survived, and what was simply documented could not. He had learned this the hard way. 7 years ago, a different hospital, a different patient, a different chain of decisions that he had assembled into a complete record and handed to the administration and watched disappear into a drawer. He had left that hospital 3 months later. He had never since produced a record that could go into a drawer. Every document he built had teeth. Every document was complete and specific and named every person in the chain, including the people who had tried to interrupt it. Because a document that recorded only failures was a document about failure. A document that recorded failures alongside the attempts to prevent them was a document you could build something from. Director Lim had never once built the first kind. "Walk me through the entrance," he said to Bay. She could have said she didn't remember. There was no timestamp, no clean camera angle, no form field, no official trace of the 4 seconds at the entrance that had seeded everything that followed. She could have said she didn't remember, and there was nothing in any record that contradicted it. Head nurse Bay stood under the fluorescent lights of her floor and she thought about Gina. 24 years old, 8 months in this role, trained by Bay. The 30-minute onboarding session on Gina's second day, Bay had run it herself, had walked her through the triage categories and the form fields and the escalation chain and the intake procedure, had taught her how this floor worked, had shown her in 11 months of shared floor time how a senior nurse moved, how a senior nurse assessed, how a senior nurse passed a patient at an entrance without stopping when her read had already been made. She had not named that as a decision. She had not identified the variable she was using. She had not named it because no one had ever named it to her. It lived in the professional body, passed from senior to junior in movement and posture and the direction of a glance, invisible in the passing and therefore invisible in the doing and therefore impossible to correct because it had never been identified as something that could be wrong. She had made the read at the entrance. She had seeded the floor. She had redirected the one doctor who tried twice to interrupt what she had started. And she had let a 24-year-old sit at the intake desk as the visible face of decisions that had been made above her. Bay opened her mouth. "At the entrance," she said. Her voice did not waver. The voice of someone who has decided that some things need to exist as words even when they do not have to. Before she reached the desk, 4 seconds, I ran my assessment and I kept walking. She stopped. Gina's read at the desk was consistent with mine. I trained Gina. I ran her onboarding session. I taught her how to work this floor. She paused and the pause was very heavy. I taught her how I work without naming it as a decision, without naming the variable I was using. Because no one ever named it to me either. She looked at the corridor doors. That doesn't make it less. It makes it harder to fix, and I know that. Another pause. And I let her sit at that desk as the visible weight of it while I managed it from behind her. That is also in the record. The waiting area was very quiet, not the quiet of absence, the quiet of a room holding something. Director Lim wrote every word. He did not look up. The matriarch had not moved from her chair. She had stopped trying to leave. Her family had stopped trying to move her. She sat and she watched Director Lim work and she watched Bay stand in what she had said and she thought about her own version of this evening. She had seen Kathy the moment they came through the doors, had seen how long she had already been there, had seen the oval she was walking, had seen the specific movement of a woman managing something enormous alone. She had watched the nurse cross to answer her son's paperwork question and she had held a thought, complete, unambiguous, specific, that the nurse should be with that woman instead. She had held it fully formed. She had said nothing. She had made a decision, and she had not recognized it as a decision, and that was the most expensive kind. She was recognizing it now. This is the moment nobody wants to look at. Not the nurse, not the receptionist, the ordinary person in the waiting area who sees exactly what is happening and chooses comfort over action. Who is responsible for what they witness and do nothing about? Drop your answer in the comments. I want this debate. Inside the delivery room, the labor turned. The monitor numbers shifted in the specific way of a body that had been doing extraordinary work alone for too long and was now presenting the bill. Not catastrophically. The specific, invisible difficulty that doesn't get written into emergency incident reports. The kind that doesn't, the particular cost of a body depleted by an hour of unsupported labor being asked to produce more of that labor after the resources available to it had already been spent. Seo Jun saw the shift before Choi did. "Stay with me," he said to Kathy. His voice did not change volume or register, but something sharpened in it. "I need you completely focused on my instructions for the next few minutes." She heard the sharpening. "Tell me what's happening." "Your body has been working without support for over an hour and the monitor is telling me about it. I'm listening to it. Stay with me." "I need to know what's happening." Not fear in her voice, not panic, The voice of a woman who has been managing variables alone all night and whose entire professional life has been built on naming things precisely, and who is not going to stop doing that now because the variable in question is her own body. Tell me the number. He told her the number. She processed it in 2 seconds, with the speed of a person who had spent 8 months in hospitals, reading monitors. I know what it is, and I know what it needs. Look at me. He waited until she did. Your body is depleted. It has been working alone since before 8 p.m. and it is registering the cost of that. This is correctable. I am correcting it right now. What I need from you is your complete attention on my instructions, and I will give you everything else when we are through this. Those are the options. She looked at him for 1 second. 2. The look of a woman running the calculation of whether this was a situation to push against or a situation to trust. Running it fast. Tell me what to do, she said. He told her. Choi moved to the other side of the table and they worked in the shorthand of 2 clinicians in a room that had no time for anything except the work itself. Seo-jun's hands moved with the specific knowledge of a man who had spent years training in rooms like this before grief took him out of them, and who had spent 6 years away from them, and whose hands had apparently not agreed with the decision to leave. The clinical instinct lived below thought and below language in the hands themselves, and it was here now, fully present, as if it had simply been waiting for a room that needed it. The monitor spiked. His eyes went to it and did not leave. He was thinking about a corridor chair in a different city. He was 22, and the number on a different screen had been changing, and he had not known what it meant, and the person who had known what it meant had not been watching it closely enough, and the distance between those 2 facts had cost him everything he had known about safety in the world. He had spent 17 years building a structure around that distance. He was standing inside that structure right now watching a number, and he was not going to look away from it. Not for 16 minutes. Not for a second. Not for anything on earth. The spike held. He adjusted. Instructed. Choi moved. Kathy breathed in the exact rhythm he gave her, trusting him completely in the specific way of a person who has run the calculation and committed to the result. The number began to move back. 4 minutes of absolute concentrated work. Then the numbers settled into a range that let him breathe again. There you are, he said quietly. Kathy let out a long, slow breath. You haven't practiced in 6 years. No. Your hands didn't know that. Something moved across his face. Brief. Then he was back at the monitor. My mother, he said. It came out differently than he had intended. Not as a rehearsed answer, but as something the pressure of the room had released without his full permission. Different hospital, different city, 17 years ago, wrong assessment, too long a wait. He paused. I was 22. I built this building, so what? Happened to her couldn't happen here. Tonight, it happened here, yes. The flag on your monitor, she said, 9:31. His hands went still. I saw the timestamp when you checked your phone in the corridor. No accusation. The researcher's voice, precise, documenting. Your system worked. It caught exactly what it was built to catch. You missed it by 16 minutes. Yes. You still came yourself. You could have sent a message. A message reaches Bay, he said. I know what Bay does with things that reach her. I have watched it happen twice tonight from a delivery room. He looked at the monitor. A person had to come. Not a directive, not a message to be actioned at whatever speed the recipient decides. A person standing in the room. That was the missing variable. So I went downstairs to be it. He paused. 16 minutes late. But you came. Yes. She held him in her gaze for a moment. Then, the intake framework governing triage on this floor. He was very still now. Different still than the clinical stillness of a moment ago. I've seen it in my research, she said. I tracked it to the consulting firm that built it. I found case files. She breathed through the base of a contraction gathering. A case study, Seoul, 17 years ago. A woman, a waiting room, a wrong assessment that held too long. She breathed through the peak, her voice steady all the way through it. Your mother is in my research thesis, Seo-jun. I read about her before I ever came to this country. The monitor ran its steady line. Choi was very still across the table. That is why you chose this hospital, Seo-jun said. I chose it because the framework that failed her is still running on this floor. I wanted to document whether it was still producing the same outcomes. She looked at him directly. 4 months ago, I sat in your waiting area with a clipboard, and I documented it, and I wrote my finding, and I filed it, and I did not flag it for immediate review, because I was 3 weeks from my fellowship deadline. She paused. Tonight, I became the finding. He stood at the monitor and said nothing for a long time. Long enough that Choi glanced at him once and looked away. The procurement report, Seo-jun said, was the review of whether to replace the framework? Yes. His voice was very controlled. I discovered the overlap 2 years after opening. I kept it running because replacing it meant a floor closure, and I was not willing to accept that. He looked at the wall. I told myself it was for the patients, that a closure would mean people not being seen. He stopped. I think I also could not accept that I had built her memorial out of the same material that killed her. Kathy looked at him for a long time, the researcher in her, and the woman in her both present simultaneously, both reading him, both arriving at the same place. You're going to change it. Yes. Tonight. He took out his phone, opened a new note. 2 lines. The framework. The decision. He saved it and put the phone away. Good, she said. The hardest contraction of the night arrived then, and the room went back to work, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, because there was nothing to say that the work itself wasn't already saying. At 10:23 p.m. the cry came. It moved through the delivery room door and down the corridor and into the waiting area the way a first cry always moves. Not like a sound arriving, but like a fact arriving. Something added to the world that had not been there a moment before, and was now permanent and real and irremovable. A person. Here. Safe. Complete. Director Lim stopped writing. Head nurse Bay's eyes closed. 4 seconds. When they opened, they were different. The eyes of a woman who had arrived at a complete and irreversible understanding of something and was not going to be leaving it. Gina put both palms flat on the desk surface and held them there as if she needed the solidity of something certain beneath her hands. Han Myung-ja stood. Her son reached for her arm. She moved out of reach without looking at him and stood facing the corridor with her hands at her sides. Inside the room, the baby arrived into the world and passed through Seo-jun's hands. 1 second, a single second, between the world and Kathy's arms, and in that second something happened in Seo-jun's face that Choi would carry out of this room and not speak about for a long time. Not a simple expression. The face of a man who has been waiting 17 years for a specific room to go differently than a room once went. The room has gone differently. The relief and the grief both fully present at once. Neither canceling the other. The weight of 17 years of building from loss, present in both simultaneously, what he had lost and what he had made of it, and both of them were in his hands for that 1 second. And then the baby was in Kathy's arms, and the room was only her. Choi looked at the baby's face. Then at Seo-jun's face. Something formed behind Choi's eyes, careful, quiet, a thought arriving and being examined and being filed away without comment. He stepped back. He slipped out of the room without a word. Seo-jun checked the monitor. Numbers good. He stood at the foot of the bed with his back half turned and let Kathy be in the room without his presence filling it. She's beautiful, he said. The softness that men who are not soft in any other context allow themselves briefly, and without announcement in the presence of something that leaves no room for anything else. Kathy looked at her daughter. at the small, perfect face, the curve of the nose, the particular architecture of the eyes closed in sleep, the specific combination of two people's features assembled for the first time in this exact arrangement. She had been looking at this face for 14 minutes, and she had been looking at Seo-jun's face for the last 2 hours. And there was something in the looking at both of them together that she had been carrying for longer than tonight. "She looks like you," Kathy said. She said it quietly, almost to herself. The way something comes out when the guard that has been holding it drops for 1 second too long. Seo-jun looked up from the monitor. "What?" She looked at him. For 1 full second, she looked at him with everything she was carrying visible in her face. All of it. The research and the history and the 18 months and the kitchen table and the 3 weeks of silence and the things she had been deciding how to say since before she walked through his front doors tonight. All of it, present and visible for 1 second. Then she looked back at her daughter. "Nothing," she said. "I'm tired." He looked at her for a moment, then at the baby, the particular curve of the baby's nose. He looked at it the way you look at something familiar in an unfamiliar context, the mild confusion of recognition without placement. He went back to the monitor. The man who saw what was happening and documented it and said nothing. The man who built the system and missed the alert. Are they the same kind of failure? And what about the woman who had the data and filed it and moved on? Is she complicit in her own suffering tonight? Comment your answer. This is the conversation this story was built to start. Han Myung-ja's request came through Choi at the half-open door. The decision was given entirely to Kathy. Seo-jun made no gesture, offered no indication. Her room. Her choice. Kathy was quiet for a moment. She looked at the door. She thought about the woman she had watched watching her from across the waiting area. The 2-second hold, the deliberate redirect, the complete thought held fully formed in silence for 40 minutes, while Kathy's oval were a path between the window and the wall. She thought about what it cost to come to this door and what it meant that she had come anyway. She thought about the difference between people who see and say nothing, and people who see, say nothing, and then come back. Let her in. The matriarch came in alone, tall, the bearing of someone who had spent decades being the most consequential person in every room she entered without needing to announce it, but something different in her posture tonight. Something had gone out of it. She came to the bedside and stopped at a deliberate distance, the precise distance of someone who understood exactly what they had and had not earned and was not going to take an inch beyond it. She did not look at Seo-jun. Deliberately, this was not his conversation to manage. "I don't have a right to be in this room," she said, direct. No softening, no preamble. "I know that. I'm asking for a minute because I need to say something to you and I would rather say it than leave with it unsaid." Kathy waited. "I was watching you from the moment my family arrived tonight. I could see how long you had already been there before we came through those doors. I watched the nurse walk to my son to answer his paperwork question." She held Kathy's eyes without flinching. "And I thought, clearly, without any ambiguity, as a complete thought, she should be with that woman instead. I thought it." She paused, and I held it fully formed, and I said nothing. For 40 minutes I sat in that room and I watched you and I said nothing. Kathy looked at her. "You had the right to be seen the moment you walked through those doors," Han Myung-ja said. "The same right as my husband, the same right as anyone. I'm not asking you for forgiveness. I'm not asking you for anything. I came to this room because I needed you to know that there was someone else in that waiting area tonight who saw what was happening to you. Not only him." She paused deliberately. "Me? And I should have spoken 2 hours ago instead of standing in this room now." Kathy studied her. She thought about what it cost to come through that door. Not the words. The words were straightforward once the decision was made. The coming through the door itself. The choice to enter a room you had no right to say something that gave you nothing back and changed nothing about what had already happened. but that needed to exist as words in a room, rather than as permanent silence in a chair in a waiting area for the rest of a person's life. A late choice, a small one, an honest one. All three of those things were true at the same time, and all three of them cost something different. "I know you saw me," Kathy said. "I watched you watch me." A pause. "I documented your look when you arrived. The 2-second hold before you looked away." She held the matriarch's eyes. "I document everything. It's what I do." Han Myung-ja received this without moving. "The woman at the desk is 24 years old," Kathy said. "She's been in that role for 8 months. She was trained to work the way this floor works, without ever being told that the way this floor works is a choice someone made. Whatever weight you're carrying out of this building tonight, she is carrying more of it than she should be, because someone with more power than her let it flow downward without naming it." She paused. "If you want to do something with what you witnessed tonight, that is where to start." The matriarch received it, did not deflect, did not qualify. She looked at the baby once, fast, the look of someone who understood the exact boundary of what they had earned, and she left. The door closed. Seo-jun was looking at the wall. He turned back to the monitor. "She should have spoken earlier," he said. "She spoke." "Is that enough?" "No." He looked at her. "The space between those two facts is where all of it lives. What should have happened and what did. What it cost, and what you build from the cost." He paused. "It's never enough. You go anyway." In the corridor, Director Lim waited with his phone. 8 names, roles, timestamps, every decision in the chain assembled in order, complete. Seo-jun read it all the way through. Bay's entrance assessment. In the record, first thing noted. Choi's 2 attempts, both in, credited. His name is in this document as the person who tried on an evening when trying was the most consequential thing anyone on that floor did. Seo-jun looked at the wall for a moment. The wealthy family. Yes? Not their fault. They arrived and they were served at the standard they were owed. The same standard Kathy Douglas was owed when she arrived. The failure was the specific decision made about her in relation to them. That distinction is in the record, and it is clear. Director Lim noted it. He looked at Seo-jun carefully. "The flag," he said, 9:31. A pause. "In the record," Seo-jun said. "All of it, including the 16 minutes. He looked at the corridor. "A document that protects the owner is not a document. It's a cover." He looked at Director Lim. "Everything." Director Lim wrote it down. Seo-jun stood in the corridor with his sleeves still rolled and thought about the other version of tonight. The version where he did not look up from the page, where the flag blinked and he read past it and sent a message that reached Bay and was managed and redirected and dissolved into the professional vocabulary of the floor, and a woman finished her labor alone near a wall in a building that was built specifically to prevent that. He thought about the 16 minutes. He had implemented the flag system after a near miss in the building's 2nd month. A child, a waiting area, a fever that had been climbing while the intake desk managed other cases. The flag had caught it. He had been at his desk, and he had seen the flag, and he had called down, and the child had been seen. He had sat back in his chair afterward, and thought about what the 16-minute version of that evening would have looked like, and he had not been able to finish the thought. Tonight, he had lived the 16-minute version. He had built the system, and missed the flag, and gone downstairs anyway, and it had been enough, barely, by the margin of one man's decision to stand up from a desk. And barely enough was not the standard he had built this building to meet. He opened his phone. The procurement report was still open. He closed it. The note with 2 lines was still there. The framework, the decision, the thing he had been deferring for 2 years. He looked at it. He added a 3rd line. 16 minutes. The specific cost of a gap between a system working and a person trusting it to work without also watching it. He saved it and put the phone away and went back through the corridor door. The baby was sleeping against Kathy's chest. The room had the atmosphere of a space that has done what it was built to do and is resting in the full weight of having done it, heavier than quiet, warmer than silence. He checked the monitor. Numbers good, line steady and clean. He checked the baby with the quick, efficient attention of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for and found what he needed to find. Then he stood at the foot of the bed and was still and looked at them both. The woman who had walked through his doors alone at 8:52 p.m. and managed 40 minutes of active labor near his far wall and been carried through his corridor and delivered her daughter in his room. And he thought about the building around him and the intention it had been built with, and the gap between intention and execution, and the 16 minutes and the 37 steps, and the photograph on the desk upstairs in the dark frame. "I need to tell you something," Kathy said. The register of it stopped him. The specific quiet of a person who has been carrying weight through an entire night and has decided that this room and this moment are where it gets set down. "The man I separated from," she said. She looked at her daughter, at the sleeping face, at the specific geometry of features assembled for the first time in this arrangement. 3 weeks ago, the kitchen table. He doesn't know she arrived tonight. She paused. "I've been deciding how to tell him something for a long time, longer than 3 weeks." She looked up at him. "I met him 2 years ago. He was at a conference in Chicago. Healthcare systems, institutional design." She watched Seo Jun's face carefully as she said the next part. "He was presenting on building systems from grief, on the gap between what you intend to build and what the building actually does in the world." She held his eyes. "I introduced myself after the session." Seo Jun was not moving. 18 months, she said. "Long distance first. Then I came to Seoul. Then 3 weeks ago we ended." She looked at her daughter. "And she was already coming. And he doesn't know yet." She looked up at him. "Her father. The man I need to call tomorrow." She stopped, took a breath. His name. The door opened. Choi, half through it, the expression of a man delivering urgency he does not want to deliver. "I'm sorry. The board chair, Director Lim, says the call cannot wait." The name was in the room, one breath away from sound. It had been building toward this room all night, through the parking lot and the intake desk and the 40 minutes at the wall and the delivery room and the flag and the 16 minutes and everything said and not yet said. And it was one syllable away from the air. Seo Jun looked at Choi, looked back at Kathy. Her face was completely open now, every layer gone. Not the researcher, not the patient, not the woman managing variables alone. Something underneath all of those. Something that had been present since she first looked up at him at the wall, and that he had not been able to name all night and was not going to be able to name in the 5 seconds before he had to walk out this door. "I'll be back," he said. He walked out. The door closed. Kathy looked down at her daughter. The face. The specific face. She had been looking at it for 26 minutes. She had been looking at Seo Jun's face for 3 hours. She had been carrying the knowledge of what connected them since before she walked into this building tonight. Since a night 14 months ago, lying awake at 3 in the morning, when she had connected 2 names across 2 documents and understood something that had reorganized everything. She thought she knew about why she had come to the city and what she had been building toward since. She had chosen Seoul for the research. That was true. She had chosen this hospital because the framework that had failed his mother was still running on his floor. That was true. She had come to Seoul because of a man she met at a conference in Chicago, who had stood at a podium and spoken about grief made structural with the specific weight of someone who had been carrying it for 17 years and had decided to make it into walls and corridors and sightlines and 37 steps he had counted alone before anyone else arrived. She had not told him she had found his mother in a case file. She had been deciding how to tell him for 14 months. Then the kitchen table. Then 3 weeks. Then tonight. She looked at the door he had walked out of. 37 steps between where he was standing right now and this room. He had counted them. He would walk them again in minutes, and when he did, she was going to say the thing she had been carrying since 3 in the morning, 14 months ago, and every day since. She looked down at her daughter, at the architecture of the small sleeping face, the particular curve of the nose that was not Kathy's nose, the shape of the eyes that were not Kathy's eyes. The face of a man who had built a building for his mother without knowing he was building it for his daughter too. "He's coming back," she said, softly, to her daughter, to the room built from grief that was now full of something else simultaneously. "And when he walks through that door, I'm going to tell him," she paused. "I'm going to tell him your name first, the one we chose together before the kitchen table, before 3 weeks ago, before everything that broke and is going to have to be rebuilt." She looked at the door. "And then, I'm going to tell him that he already knows you, that he has been building this room for you since before you existed, since before either of us walked into each other's lives." She looked at her daughter's face, at his nose, at his eyes, at the specific irreversible fact of her. "Your father built this room. He built it from losing someone, and he built it because the loss had to mean something, and it turns out it meant more than he knew." 37 steps away, at the end of the corridor, a phone call was ending. The door was about to open. If you felt that, you already know this story is not over. Subscribe right now, share this with someone who needs to see it, and leave one word in the comments, just one word, for what you think Seo Jun is about to find out when he walks back through that door. One word. I want every single one of them. The work continues. It was never supposed to be finished. You build from loss, and you come back to the camera feeds and the intake forms and the sightlines, and you keep coming back, because stopping would mean the loss had stopped meaning something, and the loss did not stop meaning something. It was the engine. It was always the engine. The building was still breathing. The work was still running, and 37 steps away a door was about to open, and nothing, not a protocol, not a framework, not 16 minutes, not 3 weeks at a kitchen table, was going to stop what was finally coming through it.